The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the Navy SEAL training compound in Coronado, California. Commander Jake Sullivan watched his team of elite warriors struggling through their 100th push-up, sweat dripping onto the hot concrete beneath them. These men were the best of the best, forged through months of grueling training that would break ordinary soldiers. Yet today something felt different about their usual routine. "Move it, ladies," shouted Petty Officer Martinez, the team's unofficial comedian. "My grandmother could do better push-ups than that, and she's been dead for 10 years. The other SEALs burst into laughter, even while maintaining their perfect form. This kind of dark humor was typical among Special Forces soldiers. It helped them cope with the intense pressure and life-threatening situations they faced regularly. Commander Sullivan had been leading SEAL teams for over 15 years. At 42, he was a decorated veteran with multiple tours in Afghanistan, Iraq, and several classified missions he could never discuss. His men respected him not just for his rank, but for his unwavering dedication to bringing every soldier home alive. He demanded perfection because anything less could mean death in the field. The team consisted of 8 highly trained operators, each with their own specialty. There was Rodriguez, the explosives expert who could make a bomb from household items or disarm one with his eyes closed. Thompson specialized in communications and could hack into enemy systems while under fire. Davis was their medic, capable of performing field surgery in the middle of a firefight. Each man had earned his place through blood, sweat, and an unshakable commitment to their brothers in arms. As the afternoon training session concluded, the SEALs gathered around the equipment shed to clean their weapons and gear. This was always a time for stories, jokes, and the kind of bonding that made them an unstoppable unit. Martinez was in the middle of telling an exaggerated tale about his weekend encounter with a bartender when they noticed an old man approaching the compound's outer fence. The stranger appeared to be in his 70s, walking with a slight limp that suggested old injuries. He wore faded jeans, a plain white t-shirt, and a baseball cap that had seen better days. Nothing about him seemed threatening or unusual, just another curious civilian who had wandered too close to the military facility. Such incidents happened occasionally, usually tourists or locals who didn't realize they were approaching a restricted area. "Looks like we've got a lost tourist," chuckled Sergeant Davis, not bothering to look up from cleaning his rifle. "Probably looking for the beach and took a wrong turn somewhere." The old man stopped at the fence and stood there quietly, his weathered hands gripping the chain links. He didn't call out or wave for attention, just watched the SEALs with an intensity that made Commander Sullivan feel slightly uneasy. There was something about the stranger's posture and the way he carried himself that seemed familiar, though Sullivan couldn't place why. "Should we go tell him to move along, Commander?" asked Thompson, finally noticing the man's presence. He's been standing there for about 10 minutes now. Sullivan studied the old man more carefully. Despite his age and civilian clothes, there was something distinctly military about his bearing. The way he stood at attention even while leaning on the fence, the precise way he positioned his feet, and the alert expression in his eyes all suggested military training. Perhaps he was a veteran, drawn to watch the next generation of warriors train. Give him a few more minutes, Sullivan decided. Maybe he's just remembering his own service days. Martinez, never one to miss an opportunity for humor, stood up and flexed his heavily muscled arms. His body was covered in tattoos that told the story of his military career. Each piece of ink represented a mission, a fallen comrade, or a significant moment in his life as a SEAL. The most prominent was a large eagle on his chest, surrounded by the names of teammates who hadn't made it home. "Check this out, old-timer," Martinez called out loudly, showing off his tattoos to his teammates. "This is what a real warrior looks like." The other SEALs laughed and began comparing their own ink, each trying to outdo the others with stories about their most painful or meaningful tattoos. The old man's expression changed when he saw Martinez's display. His grip on the fence tightened and he leaned forward slightly as if trying to get a better look. Sullivan noticed the change and felt that nagging sense of familiarity grow stronger. Something about this situation wasn't adding up. "You know what, Martinez?" joked Thompson. "I bet that old guy probably has more combat experience than all of us combined. These World War II and Vietnam vets have seen things we can't even imagine." "Please," scoffed Martinez, completely unaware of the old man's reaction. "Look at him. Probably spent his whole life pushing papers in some office somewhere." I doubt he's ever been in a real fight, let alone a war zone." The other SEALs joined in with good-natured ribbing about civilian life versus military service. They had no intention of being cruel, but their comments grew louder and more boastful as they fed off each other's energy. It was typical behavior for young warriors who had never known defeat and believed themselves invincible. Commander Sullivan found himself watching the old man more than listening to his team's banter. The stranger's face had hardened into an expression that Sullivan recognized from his own mirror after particularly difficult missions. It was the look of someone who had seen too much death and carried too many memories of fallen friends. The afternoon was growing late, and Sullivan knew they would need to wrap up soon. The team had an early morning flight for a training exercise in Nevada, and he wanted everyone well rested. But something about the old man's presence bothered him. Call it instinct or experience, but Sullivan had learned to trust his gut feelings over the years. As the SEALs continued their light-hearted mockery of civilian life, the old man slowly reached up and removed his baseball cap. His silver hair was cut in a style that was unmistakably military, despite his advanced age. Then, with deliberate movements that spoke of decades of muscle memory, he began rolling up his sleeves. Commander Sullivan's attention snapped to the old man with laser focus as those weathered hands rolled up faded sleeves. What he saw made his blood run cold and his heart skip several beats. The stranger's right forearm bore a tattoo that Sullivan knew by heart, one that haunted his dreams and filled him with both pride and overwhelming grief. The tattoo was a detailed rendering of a Navy SEAL trident, but this wasn't just any standard military ink. Wrapped around the trident were the words, Task Force Phoenix in bold letters, and beneath it, a date that Sullivan would never forget. March 15th, 2010. Below the date were 6 names written in elegant script.
Names that Sullivan whispered to himself every night before sleeping. Sullivan's hands began to tremble as memories flooded back with devastating clarity.
Task Force Phoenix had been a classified mission in Afghanistan, one of the most dangerous operations he had ever been part of. The mission had gone catastrophically wrong, and 6 brave men had paid the ultimate price. Sullivan had been the sole survivor, carrying guilt and survivor's remorse for over 13 years. The old man at the fence wasn't just any veteran. He was Master Chief Petty Officer Samuel Torres, a legend among Navy SEALs and the father of Danny Torres, one of the 6 men who died in Operation Phoenix. Sullivan recognized him now, despite the years that had aged them both. The last time they had met was at Danny's funeral, where Torres had looked Sullivan in the eye and said, "Bring my boy home to me, Commander." Sullivan had kept that promise, but it had nearly destroyed him in the process. He had carried Danny's body through 15 miles of hostile territory, fighting off enemy forces while refusing to leave his fallen brother behind. The mission had been classified for years, and most people, including Sullivan's current team, had no idea about the horrors he had witnessed that day. Meanwhile, his SEALs continued their boastful display, completely unaware of the emotional earthquake occurring just yards away from them. Martinez was now showing off his newest tattoo, a fierce-looking skull with crossed rifles, while telling an embellished story about a bar fight he had won in downtown San Diego. "I'm telling you guys, civilians just don't understand what it takes to be a real warrior," Martinez declared loudly. "They live their safe little lives while we put everything on the line for freedom. That old guy probably never had to make a life or death decision in his entire life." Rodriguez nodded in agreement, flexing his own heavily tattooed arms. "Exactly. These old-timers sit around telling stories about the good old days, but they never had to face the kind of enemies we deal with today. Technology has changed everything. Modern warfare requires a different breed of soldier." Thompson chimed in with his own opinion. "I bet half these old war stories are made up anyway. You know how memory works. Every year the fish gets bigger. Every battle gets more dangerous. By the time these guys finish telling their stories, they single-handedly won their wars." Davis, usually the most thoughtful member of the team, surprised Sullivan by joining the mockery. "I respect veterans and all, but let's be honest. Basic training was probably a lot easier back then. They didn't have the same standards we have today. Being a SEAL in the modern era requires skills those old-timers never dreamed of." The words cut through Sullivan like knife blades. Each careless comment felt like a personal attack on the memory of the 6 heroes who had died under his command. Danny Torres had been just 24 years old, younger than any of Sullivan's current team members. He had been brave beyond measure, loyal to a fault, and had died trying to save a wounded Afghan interpreter who had risked everything to help American forces. Sullivan's current team had no idea that their commanding officer bore matching tattoos hidden beneath his uniform. On his own right forearm, beneath the long sleeves he always wore, was an identical Task Force Phoenix memorial. On his left shoulder was a larger piece showing 6 eagles soaring toward heaven, each representing one of his fallen brothers. The names were burned into his memory and his skin: Danny Torres, Marcus Webb, Samuel Mitchell, Carlos Vega, Timothy Brooks, and Michael Chen. The old man at the fence had begun walking along the perimeter, moving closer to the main gate where the SEALs were gathered. His limp was more pronounced now, and Sullivan could see the telltale signs of someone who had endured significant physical trauma. Torres had been wounded in Vietnam, earning multiple Purple Hearts and a Silver Star for his service. He had spent 30 years as a SEAL, training countless operators and leading missions that remained classified to this day. "Commander, you're awfully quiet," noticed Martinez. "What do you think about our new audience member? Should we put on a show for him? Demonstrate some of our advanced training techniques?" Sullivan struggled to find his voice. His throat felt dry and his chest was tight with emotion. "I think," he managed to say slowly, "that we should show a little more respect for our elders." "Come on, Commander," laughed Thompson. "We're not being disrespectful. We're just having some fun. Besides, if he really was military, he'd understand our sense of humor. All soldiers joke around like this." The casual dismissal of Torres's service made Sullivan's anger begin to override his shock. These young warriors had no idea what sacrifice really meant. They had never lost a brother in combat, never had to write letters to grieving families, never woken up screaming from nightmares about missions gone wrong. Torres was now close enough that Sullivan could see the pain in his eyes. The old man's gaze swept over the laughing SEALs, taking in their arrogant postures and hearing their careless words. When his eyes met Sullivan's, there was a moment of recognition. Torres remembered him, just as Sullivan remembered Torres. The weight of that shared memory hung heavy in the air between them. Both men had lived with the consequences of that terrible day in Afghanistan. Torres had buried his only son, while Sullivan had buried his faith in the invincibility of American Special Forces. They were connected by grief, honor, and the unbreakable bonds forged in combat. Martinez was now regaling the team with another story, this one about a training exercise where he had outperformed soldiers from other branches of the military. His voice carried clearly across the compound, ensuring that Torres could hear every boastful word. "The thing is," Martinez continued, "these older generations just don't understand modern warfare. They fought different kinds of wars against different kinds of enemies. Today's battlefields require adaptability, technology skills, and physical conditioning that previous generations couldn't match." Sullivan watched Torres's jaw clench and his hands ball into fists. The old man's eyes never left the group of SEALs, and Sullivan could practically feel the waves of controlled anger radiating from the fence line. Torres had earned the right to respect through blood and sacrifice, yet these young operators were dismissing his entire generation as outdated and irrelevant. The situation reached a breaking point when Martinez decided to take his show to the next level. Emboldened by his teammates' laughter, and completely unaware of the emotional minefield he was dancing through, he began flexing and posing like a bodybuilder, making exaggerated faces and flexing his tattooed muscles for Torres' benefit. "Hey, old man," Martinez called out loudly, his voice carrying across the training ground. "This is what a real American warrior looks like. We're the new generation, the evolved version of military might." He struck another pose, showing off the intricate tattoos that covered his arms and chest. The other SEALs erupted in laughter and began cheering Martinez on. Rodriguez started doing jumping jacks while Thompson pretended to march in place with exaggerated military precision. Davis, caught up in the moment, began flexing his own impressive physique. What had started as harmless joking had evolved into something much more cruel and disrespectful. Sullivan felt his control slipping away. The professional composure he had maintained for 15 years of military service was cracking under the weight of watching his team unknowingly mock the father of a fallen hero. His hands clenched into fists, and he had to fight the urge to physically intervene. Torres stood perfectly still at the fence, his weathered face a mask of controlled emotion. But Sullivan could see the pain in the old man's eyes, the same pain he had seen at Danny's funeral 13 years ago. Torres was watching a new generation of SEALs behave with the same arrogance and invincibility complex that had gotten his son killed. "You know what I think?" announced Rodriguez, warming to the theme. "I think these old-timers are jealous. They see what we can do, how we train, the technology we have access to, and they wish they could have been part of something this elite." Thompson nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. They probably spent their whole careers doing basic infantry work and telling themselves they were special. But look at us. We're operating at a level they couldn't even comprehend back in their day." Each word was like a physical blow to Sullivan's chest. These young men had no idea they were describing Master Chief Torres, a man who had completed more combat missions than all of them combined. Torres had been a SEAL when being a SEAL meant something different. When every mission was do or die and technology couldn't save you if your training and courage failed, Sullivan's mind raced back to that terrible day in March 2010. Task. Force Phoenix had been tasked with extracting a high-value intelligence asset from a Taliban stronghold in the mountains of Afghanistan. The mission had been planned for months with every possible contingency accounted for. The team had consisted of 7 of the Navy's finest operators, led by Sullivan and including Danny Torres, the youngest member of the group. Danny had volunteered for the mission despite having only 6 months left on his deployment. He could have stayed back at base processing paperwork and counting down the days until he could return home to his father. But Danny Torres was his father's son, and he couldn't stand the thought of his brothers going into danger without him. The mission had started perfectly. They had infiltrated the compound under cover of darkness, neutralized the guards, and located their target. But intelligence had been wrong about the enemy strength in the area. As they prepared to extract, they were surrounded by over 50 Taliban fighters who had been waiting in ambush. What followed was 6 hours of hell that Sullivan relived every night in his dreams. His team had fought with incredible courage, holding off overwhelming odds while calling for reinforcement. One by one, his brothers had fallen. Danny Torres had died trying to carry a wounded teammate to safety. Taking 3 bullets to the chest while refusing to abandon a fellow, SEAL Sullivan had been forced to make the impossible choice between staying to fight a losing battle or completing the mission and saving the intelligence asset. He had made the hard call to extract with the asset, leaving his fallen brothers behind temporarily while he coordinated a recovery mission. The rescue operation had taken 18 hours to organize and execute. Sullivan had spent every minute of that time blaming himself for the deaths of 6 good men. When they finally returned to the compound, Sullivan had personally carried each of his fallen teammates to the extraction helicopters, refusing to let anyone else handle their bodies. Now 13 years later, he was watching Danny's father being mocked by a new generation of SEALs who thought they were invincible. The irony was devastating and infuriating in equal measure. Martinez was now shadowboxing, throwing elaborate combinations while his teammates cheered him on. "I bet I could take on any 10 guys from this old-timers generation," he boasted. "They just didn't have our level of training and conditioning." "Absolutely," agreed Davis. "Modern warfare requires a different mindset. These old guys were probably great for their time, but that time is over. We're the new apex warriors." Sullivan's vision began to blur with rage. He had reached his absolute limit. These men were his responsibility, his team, but they were dishonoring everything he believed in. They were disrespecting not just Torres, but the memory of 6 heroes who had died serving their country with honor and courage. Torres began walking toward the main gate, his limp more pronounced but his bearing still proud and military. He moved with the deliberate pace of a man who had made a decision and would not be deterred from his course. Sullivan realized that the old man intended to confront the SEALs directly. "Commander," called out Thompson, noticing Torres's approach. "Looks like our fan is coming over to meet us. Should we give him some autographs?" The casual disrespect in Thompson's voice was the final straw. Sullivan's carefully maintained composure finally snapped. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the concrete, and fixed his team with a look that could have melted steel. "That's enough," Sullivan said, his voice carrying a tone his team had never heard before. It was the voice of a man who had seen too much death and carried too much guilt. Not another word. The SEALs looked at their commander in surprise. They had never seen him react so strongly to anything, let alone what they considered harmless joking around. Martinez opened his mouth to say something, but the look in Sullivan's eyes stopped him cold. Torres had reached the gate and was standing just outside the compound, separated from the SEALs by only a chain-link fence and about 20 yards of distance. Sullivan could see him clearly now, could see the controlled emotion in his weathered face and the military bearing that years of civilian life had never quite erased. The old man reached down and slowly began rolling up his left sleeve, revealing more of the tattoos that had already captured Sullivan's attention. But this wasn't just about the Task Force Phoenix Memorial. Torres's left arm was a canvas of military history, covered in ink that told the story of 3 decades of service to his country. As Torres rolled up his left sleeve, a masterpiece of military history was revealed on his weathered arm. The tattoos weren't the flashy modern designs that covered his team's bodies. These were older, more traditional pieces that spoke of an era when military ink was earned through blood and brotherhood, rather than artistic expression. The centerpiece was a faded but still magnificent Navy SEAL trident, surrounded by dates spanning from 1968 to 1998. 30 years of active service were documented in careful detail along his forearm. Sullivan's team fell silent as they began to process what they were seeing, but they still didn't understand the full significance. Around the trident were names, dozens of them written in small, precise lettering. These weren't just random names or nicknames. They were the names of fallen teammates, brothers who had died in combat during Torres's 3 decades of service. Vietnam, Grenada, Panama, the Persian Gulf, Somalia, and countless classified operations that would never be publicly acknowledged. But it was Torres's shoulder that told the most devastating story. As he removed his shirt entirely, revealing a torso that bore the scars of multiple gunshot wounds and shrapnel, the SEALs saw a large tattoo that covered most of his upper back. It was an American flag, but not a pristine, perfect version. This flag was battle-torn and weathered, with bullet holes and tears represented in stark detail. Below the flag were more names, larger and more prominent than the others. These were the names of the men Torres had personally carried out of combat zones, soldiers he had saved through courage and determination that went beyond normal human endurance. And at the bottom, in letters that seemed to burn with intensity even after all these years, was a single phrase: "Never leave a brother behind." Sullivan's team began to realize they were looking at something extraordinary. This wasn't just any old veteran. The sheer number of names, dates, and military insignia suggested a career that spanned multiple conflicts and countless dangerous missions. Martinez's cocky smile began to fade as the reality of the situation slowly dawned on him. Torres then began the process that would change everything. With methodical precision, he rolled up his right sleeve to fully reveal the Task Force Phoenix Memorial that Sullivan already knew by heart. But Torres wasn't finished. He unbuttoned his shirt completely and let it fall to the ground, revealing the full extent of his living memorial to fallen warriors. His chest bore a massive eagle with wings spread wide, its talons clutching a banner that read, "Death before dishonor." Surrounding the eagle were purple heart symbols, each representing a wound received in combat. Sullivan counted 6 of them, meaning Torres had been wounded in action 6 different times and had returned to duty each time. But what silenced the SEALs completely was what Torres did next. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Even from a distance, Sullivan could see that it was yellowed with age and worn from frequent handling. Torres unfolded it carefully, treating it with the reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. It was a photograph, and Torres held it up so the SEALs could see it clearly. The image showed 7 young men in full combat gear, posed in front of a military helicopter somewhere in the mountains of Afghanistan. They were smiling, confident, invincible. They looked exactly like Sullivan's current team, full of pride and certain of their own superiority. Sullivan's blood turned to ice as he recognized the faces in that photograph. It was the official Task Force Phoenix team photo, taken just hours before they deployed on their final mission. There was Danny Torres, barely 24 years old, grinning at the camera with the same cocky confidence that Martinez had been displaying moments earlier. Torres pointed to his son in the photograph, then touched the Task Force Phoenix tattoo on his arm. The message was clear and devastating. This old man whom they had been mocking wasn't just any veteran. He was the father of a fallen SEAL, a hero who had died in service to his country. The silence that fell over the compound was deafening. Martinez's face had gone completely white, and his hands were trembling as the full weight of his disrespect became clear. Rodriguez took a step backward, as if trying to distance himself from his earlier comments. Thompson was staring at the photograph with his mouth open, unable to process what he was seeing. Sullivan knew he had to act. His team was experiencing the kind of shock that could either teach them humility or break them entirely. He stepped forward, removing his own shirt with deliberate movements that mirrored Torres's actions. "Gentlemen," Sullivan said, his voice carrying across the compound with quiet authority, "I'd like you to meet Master Chief Petty Officer Samuel Torres, United States Navy, retired. 30 years of active service, 6 Purple Hearts, Silver Star, Bronze Star with V device for valor, and more classified commendations than I can count." As Sullivan spoke, he began rolling up his own sleeves, revealing the tattoos he had kept hidden from his team for years. The matching Task Force Phoenix memorial on his right arm appeared first, identical to Torres' tattoo down to the smallest detail. "Master Chief Torres," Sullivan continued, his voice growing heavier with emotion, "is also the father of Petty Officer First Class Daniel Torres, who died under my command on March 15, 2010, during Operation Phoenix in Afghanistan." Sullivan's left shoulder came into view next, showing the 6 eagles soaring toward heaven, each representing one of his fallen brothers. The names were clearly visible: Danny Torres, Marcus Webb, Samuel Mitchell, Carlos Vega, Timothy Brooks, and Michael Chen. The SEALs stood frozen, watching their commander reveal a part of himself they had never known existed. Sullivan had always been professional, controlled, almost emotionally distant. They had no idea he carried this kind of pain and responsibility. Danny Torres was 24 years old when he died. Sullivan continued, his voice beginning to crack with emotion. He had been a SEAL for 3 years. He volunteered for a dangerous mission even though he could have stayed safe at base. He died trying to carry a wounded teammate to safety, taking 3 enemy bullets to the chest rather than abandon a brother. Martinez was now visibly shaking, tears beginning to form in his eyes as he realized the magnitude of his disrespect. He had been mocking the father of a fallen hero, a man who had sacrificed his only child in service to the same country Martinez claimed to defend. Torres folded the photograph carefully and returned it to his pocket. Then he walked directly to the gate, his eyes never leaving Sullivan's team. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of 3 decades of military leadership and the pain of a father who had buried his only son. "Young warriors," Torres said, his words cutting through the afternoon air like a blade, "I came here today to see what the new generation of SEALs looked like. I wanted to know what kind of men were carrying on the legacy that my son died to protect." The old man's eyes swept over each member of Sullivan's team, taking their measure with the experienced gaze of someone who had trained countless warriors over the years. "What I found," Torres continued, "were boys playing at being men, so convinced of their own superiority that they couldn't recognize real sacrifice when it was standing right in front of them." Torres' words hung in the air like a physical weight, pressing down on the shoulders of every SEAL present. The old man's voice carried the kind of authority that could only come from decades of leadership in the most dangerous situations imaginable. When he spoke, even the wind seemed to stop blowing. "My son Danny used to talk like you boys do," Torres continued, his weathered hands gripping the fence with white knuckles. "He was so proud of his training, so confident in his abilities. He thought he was invincible, just like you do. He thought the older generation didn't understand modern warfare." Martinez had tears streaming down his face now, but he stood at attention, forcing himself to listen to every word. The other SEALs were equally motionless, trapped between shame and respect as they began to understand the true weight of their earlier behavior. "Danny called me 2 weeks before his last mission," Torres said, his voice softening slightly as he remembered his son. "He told me about his team, about how they were the best SEAL unit ever assembled. He was so excited to prove himself, so eager to show the world what his generation could accomplish." Sullivan felt his own eyes filling with tears as Torres spoke. He remembered Danny's excitement before the mission, the young man's absolute confidence that Task Force Phoenix would succeed where others had failed. That confidence had been both Danny's greatest strength and, ultimately, his tragic flaw. What Danny didn't understand, Torres continued, turning his gaze directly to Sullivan, was that every generation of warriors thinks they're the first to face real danger. Every group of young soldiers believes they're stronger, smarter, and braver than those who came before them. Torres began walking along the fence line, his limp more pronounced but his bearing still unmistakably military. As he moved, he pointed to various tattoos on his arms, each one representing a story of sacrifice and brotherhood. This one, he said, indicating a faded anchor surrounded by names, represents my first combat deployment to Vietnam in 1969. I was 19 years old, just like some of you. I thought I knew everything about warfare because I had completed SEAL training. I thought the older sergeants were just telling war stories to make themselves feel important. The SEALs followed his movement along the fence, mesmerized by the living history lesson unfolding before them. Each tattoo was a window into conflicts they had only read about in history books, wars that had shaped the modern world through blood and sacrifice. I learned very quickly that those older sergeants knew things I couldn't imagine, Torres said, his voice growing harder. They had seen friends die in ways that would give you nightmares for the rest of your lives. They had made the kind of impossible choices that either break a man completely or forge him into something stronger than steel. Sullivan stepped closer to the fence, drawn by Torres's words and the shared pain they both carried. He could see the recognition in the old man's eyes, the understanding that passed between veterans who had experienced the ultimate cost of military service. This tattoo, Torres continued, pointing to a detailed submarine on his forearm, represents a classified mission in 1975 that officially never happened. 6 of us went in, only 4 came out. The 2 who didn't make it home were both younger than you are now, convinced they were invincible because they had survived training that would kill ordinary men. Rodriguez found his voice for the first time since Torres had revealed his tattoos. "Master Chief," he said quietly, "we didn't know. We were just talking, just blowing off steam after training." Torres fixed Rodriguez with a stare that could have melted concrete. "Just talking?" he repeated. "Son, words have power. The things you say about sacrifice and service matter. When you mock the previous generation, you're mocking the foundation that your own service is built on." Thompson stepped forward, his face pale but determined. "Master Chief Torres, we owe you an apology. We owe your son's memory an apology. There's no excuse for what we said." "Apologies are easy," Torres replied, his voice cutting through Thompson's words. "What matters is whether you learn from this moment or whether you continue believing you're somehow special because you carry modern weapons and use advanced technology." Sullivan could no longer remain silent. The weight of his own guilt and the pain of watching his team be confronted with their arrogance finally broke through his professional composure. "Master Chief," Sullivan said, his voice cracking with emotion, "these men don't know the whole story. They don't know what happened to Danny, what happened to our entire team. They don't know because I've never told them." Torres turned his full attention to Sullivan, and the 2 veterans locked eyes across the fence. In that moment, 13 years of guilt, pain, and unspoken understanding passed between them. "Then perhaps," Torres said quietly, "it's time they learned." Sullivan nodded and turned to face his team. These young warriors, so confident just an hour ago, now looked like children who had been caught doing something terrible. Their faces showed a mixture of shame, confusion, and desperate desire to understand what had happened. Task Force Phoenix was supposed to be a routine extraction mission, Sullivan began, his voice barely above a whisper. 7 of the Navy's best operators, sent to retrieve a high-value intelligence asset from a Taliban stronghold in the mountains of Afghanistan. As Sullivan spoke, he could see his team hanging on every word. They had never heard their commander speak about past missions, had never seen him show this kind of vulnerability. "Danny Torres was the youngest member of our team," Sullivan continued, his eyes never leaving Torres's face. "He had volunteered for the mission even though he could have stayed safe at base. He said he couldn't let his brothers go into danger without him." Martinez was openly sobbing now, understanding that his earlier boasting had been about the same kind of mission that had killed Danny Torres. The irony was devastating and educational in the worst possible way. "We thought we were invincible," Sullivan said, his voice growing stronger as he forced himself to continue. "We thought our training, our technology, our modern tactics made us superior to any enemy we might face. We thought we were the evolution of military might. just like you boys were saying earlier. Torres nodded grimly, recognizing the pattern that had repeated itself across generations of warriors. Young men, convinced of their own superiority, walking into situations that would humble them in the most terrible ways possible. The mission went wrong from the very beginning, Sullivan continued. Our intelligence was faulty. Instead of facing a small group of guards, we found ourselves surrounded by over 50 Taliban fighters who had been waiting in ambush. The SEALs could see the pain in their commander's eyes as he relived that terrible day. Sullivan had carried this burden alone for 13 years, never sharing the details with anyone who hadn't been there. For 6 hours, we fought against impossible odds, Sullivan said, his voice beginning to break. One by one, my brothers fell. Danny Torres died trying to carry a wounded teammate to safety, taking 3 bullets to the chest rather than abandon a fellow SEAL. Torres closed his eyes as Sullivan described his son's final moments. The old man had heard this story before, but it never got easier to listen to. Sullivan's voice cracked completely as he continued the story that had haunted him for 13 years. I was forced to make a choice that no commander should ever have to make. Stay and fight a losing battle where we would all die, or complete the mission and extract with the intelligence asset while calling for backup to recover my fallen brothers. The training compound had become completely silent except for Sullivan's broken words and the quiet sound of Martinez's continued sobbing. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing as the weight of the story settled over everyone present. I chose the mission, Sullivan said, his hands shaking as he remembered that terrible moment of decision. I left my brothers behind, including Danny, and extracted with the asset. It took 18 hours to organize a recovery operation and return to that compound. Torres opened his eyes and looked directly at Sullivan. Despite the pain in his weathered face, there was no anger there, only understanding. He had heard this part of the story before, during the long conversation they had shared at Danny's funeral. When we finally returned, Sullivan continued, I personally carried each of my fallen teammates to the extraction helicopters. I refused to let anyone else handle their bodies. Danny was the last one I carried out, and I promised his father that I would bring his boy home. Sullivan turned to face Torres directly, tears streaming down his face. Master Chief, I kept that promise, but it nearly destroyed me. For 13 years, I've wondered if I made the right choice, if there was something else I could have done to save them. Torres reached through the fence and placed his weathered hand on Sullivan's shoulder. The gesture was simple but carried enormous weight. It was forgiveness, understanding, and recognition of the impossible burden that Sullivan had carried alone for so long. Commander, Torres said quietly, you made the only choice you could make. You saved the mission and the intelligence asset, and you brought my son home to me. That's what a leader does. That's what Danny would have wanted you to do. The words hit Sullivan like a physical blow, but they were healing rather than harmful. For 13 years, he had been waiting for someone to tell him that he had done the right thing, that the choice he made in those desperate moments had been correct. Rodriguez stepped forward, his own face wet with tears. Commander, we had no idea. We've been serving under a man who's seen real combat, who's made real sacrifices, and we treated you like just another officer giving us orders. That's exactly the point, Torres said, turning his attention back to the SEALs. You young warriors are so focused on proving yourselves that you forget to learn from those who have already walked the path you're on. Every generation thinks they're the first to face real danger. Davis, the team medic, spoke up next. Master Chief, how do we honor your son's memory? How do we honor the sacrifice of Task Force Phoenix? We feel like we've failed before we even had a chance to prove ourselves. Torres looked at each member of Sullivan's team, studying their faces with the experienced eye of someone who had trained thousands of warriors over his career. What he saw now was different from what he had observed an hour earlier. The arrogance was gone, replaced by humility and a desperate desire to understand. You honor their memory, Torres said slowly, by understanding that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about being afraid and doing your duty anyway. You honor them by taking care of each other, by never leaving a brother behind, and by remembering that you're part of something bigger than yourselves. Thompson raised his hand slightly, like a student asking permission to speak. Master Chief, what was Danny like? What kind of SEAL was he? Torres smiled for the first time since arriving at the compound. The question had touched something deep inside him, a father's pride that death couldn't diminish. Danny was a lot like you boys, actually, Torres said, his voice warming slightly. He was cocky, confident, absolutely convinced that he was part of the greatest military force in history. But he was also loyal, brave, and willing to sacrifice everything for his teammates. Sullivan nodded in agreement. Danny was one of the best SEALs I ever served with. He had natural leadership abilities and an instinct for tactical situations that couldn't be taught. But more importantly, he understood that being a SEAL meant being part of a brotherhood. That's what you boys are missing, Torres continued, his voice becoming more intense. You're so focused on individual achievement, on proving that you're better than previous generations, that you've forgotten what military service is really about. It's about sacrifice, brotherhood, and service to something greater than yourself. Martinez finally found his voice, though it was shaky and filled with emotion. Master Chief, is there anything we can do to make this right? Any way we can honor your son and the other members of Task Force Phoenix? Torres considered the question for a long moment, his eyes moving from face to face as he evaluated the sincerity of the young SEALs. These weren't bad men, just young warriors who had lost sight of what was truly important. You want to honor them? Torres asked. Then be better than you were an hour ago. Understand that every mission you go on, every training exercise you complete, every moment you spend as a SEAL, you're standing on the shoulders of men who died to give you that opportunity. Sullivan stepped closer to the fence, close enough that he could reach through and shake Torres's hand if the old man was willing. Master Chief, would you be willing to come inside the compound? Would you be willing to tell my team more about Danny? About what it means to be a SEAL? Torres looked at Sullivan's extended hand for a long moment, then reached through the fence to grasp it firmly. The handshake was more than just a greeting. It was a passing of responsibility from one generation to the next. I'd be honored, Commander, Torres said, but only if your team understands that they're not just getting a history lesson. They're receiving a legacy that was purchased with blood. The SEALs stood at attention without being ordered to do so, their earlier casual attitude completely transformed by the weight of what they had learned. They were no longer just individual operators trying to prove their superiority. They were inheritors of a tradition of sacrifice that stretched back generations. As Torres walked toward the main gate, Sullivan's team formed up in a perfect line, each man standing with the kind of respect usually reserved for funeral ceremonies. They understood now that they were about to meet not just a veteran, but a living link to the very best traditions of military service. Martinez wiped his eyes and straightened his shoulders, preparing to meet the father of the hero whose memory he had unknowingly dishonored. Rodriguez and Thompson stood side by side, their earlier competitiveness forgotten in the face of something much more important than individual achievement. Sullivan watched his team transform before his eyes, their arrogance replaced by humility, and their casual attitude replaced by genuine respect. This was what he had been trying to teach them for months, but it had taken Torres's presence to make them truly understand. Torres entered the compound with the measured pace of a man who had walked through countless military installations over 3 decades of service. Despite his age and civilian clothes, every step he took radiated the kind of authority that could only be earned through years of leadership in the most dangerous situations imaginable. Sullivan's team remained at attention, but their posture was different now. This wasn't the rigid, formal attention of soldiers following orders. This was the respectful attention of men who finally understood they were in the presence of someone extraordinary, someone who had earned his place in military history through sacrifice and service. As Torres approached, Sullivan could see his team taking in the full scope of the old man's tattoos and scars. Up close, the evidence of Torres' military career was even more impressive. His left shoulder bore a detailed submarine surrounded by dates from classified missions. His right bicep showed a paratrooper's wings with a long list of successful jumps. Every piece of ink told a story of courage and brotherhood. Gentlemen, Sullivan said formally, I present Master Chief Petty Officer Samuel Torres, United States Navy, retired. Master Chief Torres served with distinction for 30 years, including multiple combat deployments to Vietnam, Grenada, Panama, and the Persian Gulf. Torres stopped in front of the line of SEALs and looked each man in the eye. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 3 decades of military wisdom. At ease, warriors, he said simply. We have some things to discuss. The SEALs relaxed slightly but maintained their respectful bearing. Martinez, still struggling with the emotions of his earlier behavior, was the first to speak. Master Chief Torres, sir, I owe you the deepest apology a man can give. My words and actions today were inexcusable. I dishonored your son's memory and everything you've sacrificed for this country." Torres studied Martinez for a long moment, taking the measure of the young warrior's sincerity. What he saw was genuine remorse and a desperate desire to make things right. "Son," Torres said finally, "apologies are just words. What matters is what you do with this lesson. Danny made some of the same mistakes you made today. He was young, proud, and absolutely convinced that his generation of SEALs was superior to everyone who came before them." Rodriguez stepped forward next. "Master Chief, you said Danny was like us. How did he learn to be better? How did he become the kind of SEAL who would die for his teammates?" Torres smiled slightly, remembering his son's transformation from cocky young warrior to mature military leader. "Danny learned the same way you're learning right now. He made mistakes, got humbled by reality, and eventually understood that being a SEAL wasn't about individual glory. It was about brotherhood and sacrifice." Sullivan watched the interaction between Torres and his team with growing amazement. The old man was achieving something in minutes that Sullivan had been trying to accomplish for months. He was teaching these young warriors about humility, respect, and the true meaning of military service. "Let me tell you about the real Danny Torres," Torres continued, settling himself on a nearby equipment crate, as if he were about to address his own troops. "When Danny first joined the SEALs, he was exactly like you boys. He thought his training made him invincible. He thought previous generations of warriors were outdated and irrelevant." The SEALs gathered around Torres in a loose semicircle, hanging on every word. This wasn't just a story about a fallen hero. It was a mirror showing them their own attitudes and behaviors. "Danny's first deployment was to Iraq in 2007, Torres said. He was assigned to a veteran team led by a Master Chief who had been a SEAL since the 1980s. Danny spent the first month of that deployment thinking he knew better than his team leader." Thompson leaned forward, completely absorbed in the story. "What changed his mind, Master Chief?" "Reality," Torres said simply. "On Danny's first combat mission, his overconfidence nearly got his entire team killed. He ignored his team leader's orders and broke formation, thinking he could handle a situation better than a man with 20 years of experience." Sullivan could see his team understanding the parallel to their own attitudes. They had been doing the same thing, thinking they knew better than the generations of warriors who had established the traditions and tactics they used every day. "What happened?" asked Davis, his voice quiet with concern. "Danny walked into an ambush that his team leader had suspected, but that Danny's arrogance had prevented him from seeing," Torres explained. 3 members of his team were wounded, pulling Danny out of the situation he had created. Good men shed blood because a young warrior thought he was smarter than his experienced leader. The weight of that lesson settled over Sullivan's team like a physical force. They could all see themselves in Danny's mistake, could all recognize their own overconfidence in the young SEAL's error. "But here's the important part," Torres continued, his voice growing stronger. "Danny didn't make excuses. He didn't blame his team leader or his training. He accepted responsibility for his mistake and dedicated himself to learning from it. He spent the rest of that deployment asking questions, listening to stories, and studying the experiences of every veteran he could find." Martinez wiped his eyes again, clearly moved by the story. "Master Chief, how do we make sure we don't make the same mistakes? How do we honor the lessons Danny learned?" Torres stood up and began walking among the SEALs, studying each man individually. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had spent decades molding young warriors into mature leaders. "You start by understanding that every piece of equipment you use, every tactic you employ, every tradition you follow was developed by warriors who came before you," he said. "Men who learned these lessons through blood and sacrifice, often paying with their lives for knowledge that you now take for granted." Sullivan stepped forward, adding his own voice to the lesson. "Master Chief, Torres is right. Every technique we teach you, every piece of gear in your kit, represents lessons learned by previous generations of SEALs. When you dismiss their experience, you're throwing away wisdom that could save your lives." Torres nodded approvingly at Sullivan's words, then continued his teaching. "Danny learned to respect the experience of older warriors, not because they were perfect, but because they had survived long enough to pass on their knowledge. Every gray-haired sergeant, every veteran officer, every retired warrior carries lessons that you haven't learned yet." Rodriguez raised his hand slightly. "Master Chief, what would Danny think of us now? After our behavior today, would he want us as his teammates?" The question hit Torres like a physical blow, and for a moment the pain of losing his son was visible on his weathered face. But when he answered, his voice was steady and filled with the wisdom of someone who had spent years thinking about legacy and honor. "Danny would forgive you, just like I'm forgiving you," Torres said quietly. "But he would also expect you to be better tomorrow than you were today. He would expect you to learn from this moment and carry that lesson with you for the rest of your careers." Sullivan could see the transformation in his team's faces. The arrogance was completely gone, replaced by something much more valuable: humility, respect, and a genuine desire to live up to the standards set by those who had sacrificed everything for their country. "Gentlemen," Sullivan said, addressing his team formally, "Master Chief Torres has given us a gift today. He's shared his son's story and his own experience to teach us lessons that could save our lives and the lives of our teammates. How do we repay that gift?" Thompson stepped forward, his voice steady and determined. "By being worthy of the legacy we've inherited. By remembering that we're not just individual operators, but part of a brotherhood that stretches back generations." Torres smiled and reached out to shake Thompson's hand. "Now you're beginning to understand, son. Being a SEAL isn't about proving you're better than everyone else. It's about being worthy of the trust your teammates place in you." As the afternoon sun began to set over the training compound, Sullivan's team had been transformed from arrogant young warriors into humble inheritors of a noble tradition. They understood now that their strength came not from their individual abilities, but from their connection to generations of heroes who had sacrificed everything for their country. Torres gathered the team one final time, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years of military wisdom and the pain of a father who had buried his only son. "Remember this day," he said simply. "Remember that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to do your duty despite that fear. Remember that you're part of something bigger than yourselves, something worth dying for." The SEALs would indeed remember this day for the rest of their careers, carrying Torres' lessons with them into every mission and every moment of danger they would face. They had learned that true strength comes not from arrogance but from humility, respect, and the unbreakable bonds of brotherhood forged in service to something greater than themselves.